The relay station had been quiet for 11 days before Mara Solis started painting on the walls. She didn't plan it. She'd been using a piece of burnt polymer casing to note down atmospheric readings. Pressure, ion density, the slow crawl of magnetic flux across the quartz highlands. And somewhere between the third notation and the fourth, she'd stopped writing numbers and started drawing the ridge. The way it looked at dusk, when the light came in sideways, and the silica in the rock threw back 100 different colors, pink and amber and a deep arterial red she didn't have a name for. She drew that. She drew it badly, with a piece of melted debris on a concrete wall that smelled of ozone. And when she stepped back and looked at it, she felt something shift behind her sternum. Not hope, exactly. She wasn't sure she still remembered what hope felt like, but something. The Vekhari had hit the relay station on the 42nd day of the Oris campaign. Mara had been running a routine diagnostic on the long-range arrays when the first quieting pulse hit, and she remembered exactly what it felt like. Not pain, not noise, but a sudden, terrible sense that none of it mattered. The diagnostic, the arrays, the campaign, the war. A wave of meaning draining out of everything, like water out of cupped hands, and her just standing there watching it go. She'd been trained for it. Every soldier posted to a Vekhari theater got the briefing, the cognitive drills, the pharmaceutical protocols. She'd taken her pills that morning. They hadn't done much. The pulse had lasted 11 seconds. Trit. Long enough for Corporal Dietrich to walk out of the station's eastern airlock without his suit. Long enough for Sergeant Park to set down her rifle and sit in the corner of the communications bay and simply stop responding to anything said to her. Long enough for the station's automated defense grid to misfire on the supply depot and take out the fuel cells along with the only functional shuttle. After the pulse, the bombardment had come as almost a relief. At least a bombardment was something Mara knew how to respond to. She'd survived it in the station's sublevel, wedged behind a water recycler with her hands over her ears, listening to the sounds of the world outside, becoming very small and very far away. The ceiling of the upper floor came down, she hadn't moved. When the power went, she hadn't moved. When the sound stopped, she'd waited another 6 hours in the dark, counting her own heartbeats. Before she finally crawled out, she was the only one left. This was, she had decided in those first terrible days, a logistical problem. Not a personal one. The relay arrays were damaged but not destroyed. 2 of the 7 towers still stood, and if she could restore the power coupling between them, she could get a signal out. Not a strong signal, not a targeted one, but something. She was a comms officer, and comms officers solved problems like this. And she would solve this problem, and that was the beginning and the end of the analysis. She did not think about Dietrich. She did not think about Park, sitting in the corner in the communications bay, which was now buried under 3 meters of rubble. She did not think about the rest. She thought about the power coupling, and the water recycler and the ration packs she'd inventoried on day 1, 43 packs, which at half rations was 86 days, and the 2 antenna towers standing against the pale sky like burnt fingers, and what it would take to connect them. Quartz highlands of Oris 4 were a geologist's idea of beautiful and a soldier's idea of a nightmare. The terrain was all shattered shelves and broken columns, silica formations that caught light and threw it back in colors that made your eyes lie to you. Distances compressed and expanded by refraction in ways that kept tricking Mara's navigation instincts. The alien sky was a color she still didn't have a word for, somewhere between green and gold, and neither of those things. And it pressed down on everything with a weight that was partly atmospheric and partly something else. She'd known that second part before. The briefings had warned her. The Vekhari didn't fight the way humans fought. They'd evolved from something sessile. The xenobiologists were still arguing about the exact taxonomy, but the operational consensus was something like a colonial organism, a distributed intelligence that had learned over millions of years to neutralize threats not by destroying them, but by making the threats stop wanting to be threats. Their biology was built for suppression. The quieting was the weaponized version of what was essentially their immune response, a broad-spectrum signal that interfered with the neural structures responsible for motivation, meaning-making, goal pertinacent. It didn't make you want to die. It made you stop caring whether you lived. It was, the briefing documents said in their particular bureaucratic way, extremely effective against species with highly developed goal-oriented cognition. Mara thought about this a lot in the first week. She had a lot of time to think. What the briefings hadn't said, what she suspected nobody had really understood yet. Because the Oris campaign was only humanity's fourth direct engagement with Vekhari forces, and the first three had all ended the same way, was that the quieting wasn't a single pulse. It was a frequency, a sustained thing. The big pulse was just the spike that cleared the area, the acute dose. What came after was the chronic one. A low-level bleed of the same signal. Too weak to drop a healthy adult in seconds, but strong enough, over days and weeks, to sand down the edges of everything. To make the repair work feel pointless. To make the ration count feel irrelevant. To make the drawing on the wall feel stupid and small. She knew it was happening. That was the worst part. The cognitive training worked well enough that she could observe the process, could feel her motivation leaking away, and identify it as artificial, as the Vekhari signal, and not her own mind, and still not be entirely able to stop it. The drawing helped. That had surprised her. On day 4, she'd gone back to the wall and added to it, drawing the second ridge, the one to the east that she never went to, because the terrain was too broken to cross safely. And then the way the sky looked above it at midday, which was different from dusk, more silver, the light dispersed through high cloud. She used the polymer casing until it wore down to a nub, and then switched to a piece of rusted conduit she found in the sublevel. The rusted conduit made thicker marks. She learned to work with that. She told herself it was a therapeutic exercise, which it was. She also told herself she didn't care about it, which was not entirely true. The power coupling problem was harder than she'd initially assessed. One of the standing towers had sustained a structural fracture 60% of the way up its height, and the coupling conduit ran through the section directly above the fracture. She couldn't reach it from below, and the tower wasn't stable enough to climb, without a high probability of finishing what the bombardment had started. She spent 2 days working out the geometry of the problem, sketching load paths in the dirt with her boot, checking and rechecking the math, and arrived at an answer she didn't like. She needed a counterweight system to stabilize the tower enough to climb, and the only material with sufficient mass in the available debris field was the collapsed upper floor of the station, most of which was in pieces too awkward to move alone. She moved them anyway. It took 9 days. On the 3rd day, she thought very clearly, this is not going to work. The thought was flat and gray, and it arrived without drama, the way the quieting always worked. Not a cry of despair, but a statement of fact, delivered in her own voice. She sat with it for a moment, feeling its weight, identifying its origin. Vekhari signal. Not her conclusion. Not based on any evidence she hadn't already accounted for. She picked up the next piece of debris and moved it. The 5th day, she found Park. She'd been working through a section of collapsed wall, and she shifted a slab of prefab panel. And there was Park underneath, or what was left of her. She'd clearly survived the bombardment, or survived it long enough to get to this corner, the one she'd retreated to after the pulse, and then the ceiling had come down around her. Mara sat next to what remained of Sergeant Park for a long time. She didn't cry. She felt the quieting pressing on her chest like a stone, and she sat with that too, and eventually she stood up and kept working. She buried Park in the quartz rubble at the eastern edge of the station perimeter, which was as much of a burial as the terrain allowed. She marked the spot with a piece of antenna housing stood upright in the rocks. It was the right thing to do, and it took time she could not really afford, and she did it anyway because she was human, and that was what humans did, and she needed to remember that. She was starting to understand that the remembering was the battle. The Vekhari, as far as anyone had been able to determine, had no art, no music, no visual representation. Nothing that corresponded to making something for the purpose of expressing something. They communicated in chemistry and vibration, efficient and precise, nothing wasted. They were extraordinarily intelligent by any measure that mattered militarily. They had interstellar travel, directed energy weapons, the quieting. They had nothing that looked like a painting. Mara thought about this on day 8 while she worked on the counterweight rig. Her hands raw from the cable she'd been threading through a makeshift pulley system cannibalized from the station's vehicle bay. She was thinking about it because she was trying to understand the quieting more precisely, not psychologically, which she'd been doing for days, but mechanically. How it worked. What it actually targeted. The briefing said motivation, meaning-making, goal-perdman. The briefings had been written by people who hadn't been here. What Mara was finding, in the slow empirical way of someone with too much time and not enough distractions, was that the quieting didn't actually target her ability to pursue goals. She was pursuing goals fine. She was moving rubble and threading cables and eating half rations and sleeping in 4-hour intervals and doing all of it with reasonable efficiency. What it targeted was something a layer beneath that. It targeted the part of her that cared why. That was the distinction. She could act. She was losing the ability to mean. The drawing on the wall was the only thing that pushed back against this in a way she didn't fully understand. Not because it was practically useful. Because it wasn't. Because it was entirely, defiantly, stubbornly pointless from any operational perspective. And she made it anyway. And the making of it reminded some part of her brain that she was still a person who could decide what mattered. That meaning wasn't assigned by circumstances, that she could make it herself, out of nothing, the way she was making it out of a burnt piece of polymer and a concrete wall. She was painting a Vekhari unit position. This had not been her intention when she started. She'd been drawing the landscape, because the landscape was what she could see and she'd needed something to see clearly. But the Vekhari unit that had taken position on the northern ridge, there since day 6, stationary, presumably monitoring the station site for activity she wasn't bothering to conceal, was part of the landscape now. She drew it as she drew everything else. Attentively, without judgment, trying to get the shapes right. It was strange to look at them. From this distance, through the scope of her salvaged monocular, they looked like something between a coral formation and a flock of birds. A cluster of pale, branching forms that moved as a single unit, slowly, with the unhurried patience of something that had been doing this for a very long time. They were not ugly, were alien in the most complete sense of the word, a thing evolved for an entirely different version of reality, functional and internally coherent and deeply, completely not human. She drew them. She drew the way they arranged themselves at dusk, the way the light caught their surfaces. She drew the strange regularity of their movement patterns, she thought. I'm the last human on this rock, and I'm drawing portraits of the things that put me here. Shots, he thought this without bitterness. Or with bitterness that the quieting had pressed flat enough that it felt from the inside, like equanimity. On day 11, the counterweight rig worked. She tested it 3 times before she trusted it. The tower groaned and shifted and held. She started to climb. The climb was 40 meters of improvised ascenders along a structure she'd assessed as probably stable enough, which was not the same as definitely stable enough. And she was aware of this distinction with every move she made. She went slowly. She checked anchors. She listened to the metal. Halfway up, a gust of Orus wind hit the tower from the west, and it shuddered all the way down through the cable and into her hands, and she stopped and held on, and waited for the shudder to stop and then kept climbing. The coupling junction was where she'd calculated it would be. It looked like it had been hit by shrapnel rather than the direct bombardment. Component damage, not structural. She had the parts to fix it. She had the tools. She'd been carrying them in a pack on her back for 40 meters of climbing and they were heavier than they'd felt on the ground. She found a position she could hold without her arms giving out and started working. It took 2 hours. 1 point a second gust hit and she wrapped her legs around the tower housing and pressed her face against the cold metal and held on, her hands still on the junction, because she wasn't going to drop the tools now. She was not going to do that. And the tower swayed and steadied, and she straightened up and kept working. When the junction sparked and the power indicator on her wrist unit went green, she allowed herself 30 seconds. She did not have anything to say. Nothing felt adequate. She pressed her forehead to the metal housing of the repaired junction and breathed. And the tower held her, and the alien sky was its indefinable color above her. And she thought about Dietrich and Park and all the rest of them. and she let herself feel it fully for those 30 seconds. The grief and the anger and the stubborn, stupid fact that she was still here. And then she began to climb back down. Signal she could transmit was narrow and weak, zero point 0.3 megahertz, degraded by the single array geometry, carrying maybe 100 kilometers if the atmospheric refraction cooperated. Not far enough to reach fleet, not targeted enough to do anything useful by conventional military standards. She thought about this for a day. She ran the math several times. The math kept giving her the same answer. She thought about the Vekhari on the northern ridge, who had been watching the station site for 11 days and done nothing. They weren't coming to finish the job. They didn't need to. The quieting would finish it. That was how they'd won the last 3 engagements. Not by destroying human forces directly, but by settling in around them and letting the signal do its work, waiting for the humans to become inert. They were waiting for her to stop. She thought about the signal and what it could carry. She thought about the drawing on the wall. On day 14, she began the transmission. Not tactical data, not a distress call, though she embedded one in the subcarrier. She broadcast, for 11 hours, until her power cells needed to cycle, was something the Vekhari, as far as she knew, did not have a category for. She had worked on it for 2 days. She had no digital tools. The station systems were down, and she was working from her own memory and what she could reconstruct by hand. She had an audio transcription unit she'd salvaged from the comms bay rubble, cracked screen but functional, and she used it to generate a modulated carrier signal, and she encoded into it the following things. Her voice, reading aloud the names of everyone who had been stationed at Relay Post Oris 7. All 17 of them. She read each name at a normal speaking pace, and then paused. She did this twice, then she sang. She was not a good singer. This had never been relevant to her military career, and she had not thought about it in several years. She sang a song her grandmother had sung. Something very old, she didn't know its origin. A working song from somewhere in the Andean Altiplano, back on a planet she hadn't been to in 8 years. She remembered the words inexactly, and filled in the gaps with syllables that sounded right, and might not have been. She sang it twice through. Then she described, in as much detail as she could manage in spoken word, what the quartz highlands looked like at dusk. The colors in the rock, the way the alien sky went strange and heavy before dark. She spoke for 40 minutes about this, improvising, pulling up every detail she could find in her memory, the specifics and the textures, the way it looked and felt and what it made her think of. And she was aware that she was doing something the briefings had not covered, something that was not in any protocol she had been trained in. And she did not stop. She talked about the drawing on the wall. She described each element, the ridges, the silica formations, the Vekhari unit on the northern slope, the sky, as carefully as she could, the way a person might describe a painting to someone who couldn't see it. She used the word beautiful. She used the word strange. She used the word lonely, and she meant all 3. She described Park's grave marker, the piece of antenna housing standing upright in the quartz rubble, and how it looked in the morning light. Then she went silent and cycled the power cells and began again. She transmitted for 11 days. The Vekhari unit, on the northern ridge, began behaving strangely on the 3rd day. She noticed it through the monocular. They were no longer arranged in their usual formation. They'd spread out. They were moving individually in ways they hadn't before. Not patrol patterns, not anything she could map to a tactical purpose. They moved the way things move when they're trying to understand something. On the 6th day, 3 of them came to the edge of the ridge and stopped. They stayed there for 4 hours. She watched them, through the monocular, eating a half ration of something that tasted like compressed chalk. Watching these alien things watch her station. She had no idea what they were processing. She had no idea if the transmission was reaching them at all, if they were receiving radio frequencies, if the concepts in the transmission had anything corresponding to them in Vekhari experience. She was not transmitting at them. She was transmitting at any human receiver within 100 kilometers, which might be no one, which was probably no one. She waved at them anyway. She waved at the 3 Vekhari on the ridge from the doorway of her ruined station like an idiot. Because what else was she going to do? and after a moment she laughed, which was the first time she had laughed in 17 days, and the laugh sounded strange and hoarse in the silence, and it echoed off the quartz formations, and came back to her slightly altered, and she laughed again. Sitting was still there. She could feel it, the low-level pressure, the way it tried to make her voice feel pointless and small. She could feel it, and she kept laughing anyway, because the specific and precise human truth of the moment. 3 alien organisms, standing on a ridge, watching a filthy, half-starved officer wave at them from a pile of rubble, was just genuinely funny, and the Vekhari signal had not yet found a way to make genuinely funny things stop being funny, and she didn't think it ever would. She went back inside and made a notation in the transmission log, and then went and sat in front of the wall and looked at her drawings for a while. She'd been adding to them every day. The wall was nearly full now. The landscape occupied most of it, the ridges in the sky and the quartz formations in all their strange colors, and the Vekhari unit on the northern slope rendered in smeared rust and polymer black, and in the corner, small, a figure she'd drawn on day 9 without entirely meaning to. A person in a suit standing on a high place, looking at something beyond the edge of the wall. She hadn't drawn a face. She hadn't needed to. On day 22, the fleet arrived. Not because of her signal. The signal had never reached fleet. What the signal had reached, it turned out, was the forward operating base on Oris 6, which had been operating under communications blackout due to a Vekhari disruption field, and which had cracked that field 12 days after she started transmitting. First thing their newly restored receivers had picked up was a woman's voice reading 17 names, and then singing, and then talking about colors in rocks for 40 minutes. The intelligence officer who debriefed her later said that the transmission had been flagged immediately as anomalous because the Vekhari disruption field worked on the same frequency band as the quitting, and they'd expected anything coming through a degraded relay station in an active Vekhari theater to be distress traffic or static. They had not expected 40 minutes of landscape description. She told him about the drawing on the wall. He wrote it down very carefully. The tactical development that would eventually become known as the Aris Protocol and began in the classified record on the day of Mara's rescue, not because of anything she'd specifically done militarily. She'd repaired a relay junction, which was useful but not decisive. She'd generated a weak signal that had reached a base that was itself already cracking its communication blackout. She had not turned the tide of the war. What she'd done was demonstrate something that the Vekhari had not anticipated, and for which their entire strategic framework had no counter. The intelligence team spent 3 months analyzing the behavior of the Vekhari unit on the northern ridge. There were good sensors on the fleet survey drones that reconstructed the timeline retroactively, and what they showed was this. From the moment the transmission began, the Vekhari unit had been displaying behaviors that had no tactical explanation. Panic, not retreat, something more like disturbance. The kind of disturbance that spread through a colony organism when one part of it encountered something the whole system didn't know how to process. The Vekhari had spent 1,000,000 years evolving a suppression field that worked by targeting meaning. They had won 4 engagements against a species with highly developed goal-oriented cognition, by making that cognition turn against itself, by making meaning feel contingent and fragile and not worth fighting for. They had not, apparently, accounted for what happens when the thing you're fighting makes meaning anyway. Not in defiance, not heroically, practically, persistently, because it's human, and it's what humans do. Because somewhere in 100,000 years of evolution the species had learned that the way to stay alive when everything tries to make you stop caring is to make something. A song, a story, a drawing on a wall, and mean it. Protocol that came out of this was not simple. The quieting was still a serious threat. Pharmaceutical countermeasures improved. Cognitive training improved. But the core of the Oris Protocol was something that made the military brass deeply uncomfortable for about 4 months before the results became impossible to argue with. Creativity mandates. Every unit deployed to Vekhari theater was required to produce something. Art, music, writing, cooking, the building of unnecessary things, the telling of stories. acquired in the same mandatory way as weapons maintenance and PT, log tracked. The thing you did at the end of a shift before you went to sleep. The signal you sent to yourself that you were still a person who made things. That meaning was not a resource to be depleted, but a practice to be kept up. It felt stupid to a lot of people. It felt stupid to Mara too, if she was honest. The formalization of it, the logistics of mandated creativity. It wasn't what she'd done on that ridge. What she'd done on that ridge was more personal and more desperate than any protocol. Something that had come from a place too specific and too raw to translate cleanly into doctrine. She also understood what they were trying to preserve. The fact that there is a word in 100 human languages, maybe in all of them, for the act of making something where nothing was before, that the species had never stopped doing it, that even alone on a rock with 17 dead, and a hostile alien force watching from the ridgeline, and a suppression field trying to make it all feel meaningless, the humans had kept making things. Because they were very old and very stubborn, and because it was the one thing, in the end, that couldn't be suppressed. It could be pressured. It could be starved of resources and time and stability. It could be made to feel pointless, and the Vekhari were very good at that, the best anyone had ever encountered. Could not be made to stop. Or went back to Oris 4 once, 2 years later as part of a survey team during the armistice negotiations. The relay station site was still rubble, hadn't been cleared. She walked through it in a fresh suit with 2 escorts who had the good sense to stay back. She found the wall. It had survived better than she'd expected. The sublevel had shielded most of it from the secondary structural collapses, and the drawings were still there. Faded, dusty, one section cracked through by a fallen beam, but legible. Ridges, the sky, the Vekhari on the slope, the small figure on the high place, looking at something beyond the edge. She stood in front of it for a long time. One of the escorts came to the doorway eventually and asked if she was ready to go. She looked at the wall, at the 17 names she'd added in the lower right corner at some point. She didn't remember exactly when. It must have been in those last days of transmission, and the handwriting was worse than usual. Cramped and uneven, but readable. All 17. She thought about what it had meant to her in those days to keep making things. Not as a strategy, as a necessity. The difference between those 2 framings mattered to her, even now, 2 years out, because the protocol had made it a strategy, and the strategy had worked, and she was glad it worked, and something about the translation still bothered her, in ways she found hard to articulate. What it had actually been, on day 4, drawing the ridge with a piece of burnt polymer, it hadn't been resistance. It hadn't been a decision. It had been closer to breathing. Something the body does because it has not stopped being the kind of thing that does it. She traced the outline of one ridge with one gloved finger, not touching quite. Close, the escort asked again. Yeah, she said. She took one last look at the small figure in the corner, suited, standing high, looking outward, and then she turned and walked back into the alien light, which was that color she still didn't have a word for, somewhere between green and gold and neither, pressing down on the quartz highlands with its old familiar weight. She was already thinking about what she'd make next.